It's January 2023, and in this video I will be speaking in crayon. Now, this topic and the subtopics I've discussed over the many years, perhaps past decade or more, and I'm going to be revisiting this because it's important, especially in today's world. Now, I've said repeatedly over the many years how people who call themselves truthers and freedom types, and I'm just going to segue for a moment, I am not a truther, I'm not a freedom type, nor am I a Freeman on the land type, never have been, never will be. I digress. But I've highlighted how truther and freedom types cannot help one individual with, for example, injustice and tyranny, but yet they think that they can change the world. And I've also stated many times, most may wake up to one or several things only to slumber in something else while slumbering in everything else. And I've highlighted over the years some famous cases of injustice, tyranny, and even cases that you've never heard of, nor will you hear of. I've highlighted cases, for example, with groups, and I've even discussed the events that began in 2020 and the so-called protest of rubber. Now, I'm going to start off by highlighting two very famous cases of injustice, tyranny. Now, why is this important? Because the very foundation of, for example, real or perceived, and I'm approaching this video from a neutral perspective here, the very foundation of injustice and tyranny, say on a worldwide scale, comes from the countless of cases that happen every day, which no one knows about or perhaps don't even care about. And it's very interesting how truther and freedom types want to learn to run before they even learn to crawl, and trying to fight injustice and tyranny and all this other stuff. Now, the two famous cases that I'm going to address, the first one is Daniel Holtzclaw, former Oklahoma police officer. He's spending 367 years in prison for crimes he never committed. And I'm just going to briefly go over that story real quick. And there is a documentary called Daniel in the Den, and I recommend watching that documentary because the people who wrongfully convicted him or some of the people are in that documentary. But the gist of his story is he pulled over different kinds of people, women, and for whatever, driving infractions and so forth. And if I remember correctly, I'm just going by memory here, One of them got upset, worried about some issues with her significant other or something because of that, and complained, and it just spiraled out of control. And when you watch that documentary, very clearly you can see how they were told what to say by so-called investigating detectives so they can have an innocent man, Daniel Holtzclaw, convicted. It's a tragedy. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, oh, yeah, that's terrible, but whatever. Again, you have to keep in mind, these types of cases create the framework for larger injustices and tyranny, as well as examples of what real injustice is. And I'll get to that later on. So that's Daniel Holtzclaw, and again, the documentary about him, his story, Daniel in the Den. Now, there's another individual, some might call Average Joe. His name is Stephen Avery. Now, initially, his story goes, he was wrongfully convicted of raping a woman, and they knew that he was innocent, but they still convicted him. Long story short, he served 17 years in prison, and the woman who identified him said it was a mistake. So he was completely vindicated. So he was released for about 2 years, and during that time, he went to sue the state. And 2 days before the lawsuit began, they pinned a murder on him. And that took care of that lawsuit. Basically, he had to settle for peanuts. And that wrongful conviction for that murder, when you watch his documentary called Making of a Murderer, and I believe it's a 10-part documentary, each part is 1 hour, well worth watching, but they sent him to prison for life. Now, he did have a questionable youth, getting into trouble and doing some bad things, which he admitted and changed. But for whatever reason, he was targeted and he is wrongfully imprisoned. So there's two famous cases of injustice, tyranny. Again, these things build the foundation, set the stage for larger injustices and tyranny. I've even highlighted a man by the name of John Ramses. Probably never heard of him. I did do a whole video about him, his story. I think afterwards I did mention him in some depth in another video. But here's a man who went to a different country, fell in love, started a family, and unfortunately him and his significant other parted ways, and there was some issue when it came to the custody part. Now keep in mind, throughout his whole divorce proceedings and everything else, nothing was ever brought up. Everything went relatively smooth until it came to the custody. He moved back to the United States and wanted to bring his daughter once a year. He'll pay for everything to visit the United States. And this is where the problem began, where a false accusation. That ended up costing him, I believe, 6.5 years in prison. Finally, he was released, came back to the United States, and ever since he's been trying to pick up the pieces of his life. Injustice, tyranny, based on a false accusation. Now you might be thinking, okay, well, these are just like little individual cases. There are countless cases every day, just like these 3 examples. But let's up the scale a little bit. Let's talk about the Weaver family, Ruby Ridge. Now, some of you may have heard of that and what happened there. And there's a documentary about Ruby Ridge, which I recommend watching as well. Now, this particular story, again, dealing with injustice and tyranny, not only does it show injustice and tyranny on a larger scale than, say, for example, an individual, because there was a whole family and everyone that suffered, paid the biggest price with their lives, 2 survivors. But you can also take some other lessons from their story in the next example I'm going to give as well. What happens when you try to live a simple life? So the Weaver family, they went up into the mountains, want to live off grid and just live a normal, peaceful life. But the system, let's call it the system overall, didn't like that too much. So they want to pin something on him. And when they went to, dare I say, as a descriptive, execute their plan, the whole family was executed. There's a documentary on that story as well. Injustice and tyranny. We just up the scale a little bit now. How about another example? David Koresh, Waco, Texas. Many of you have heard of that story and how they vilified David Koresh and the families that were in that building. Now that story ties into Ruby Ridge because they realized, government officials and law enforcement, various law enforcements, how they screwed that one up. So they were going to do this one properly. And that ended up even worse than Ruby Ridge, where families were literally burnt alive in the building. And yes, there is a documentary about that story and the truth. Now, if you still think that these 2 examples of Ruby Ridge and Waco, Texas, these people were crazy, guilty, whatever, you're not a truther nor you're a freedom fighter. Dare I say you're delusional, but I digress. So there's 2 more examples of injustice and tyranny. And we see this type of thing happening all the time. And there's other stories. I remember, for example, one story, I don't even remember the name or where it took place. I know it was in the US, where a family, I guess you could say, stood their ground to defend whatever, their home, and they all perished. Countless of cases like this all the time. Again, these types of cases set the foundation for example, tyranny and justice on a worldwide stage. Happens all the time. but no one steps up to even acknowledge these people or help these people. Where are all the protests and the banding together? Because you have to look at it this way. Regardless of your group size, it's made up of individuals. And it's each individual within any group on any topic, any movement, whatever, that will be isolated and targeted. It's not going to be something like from a Hollywood movie, for example, where it's the whole group. No. And again, how innocent people are convicted is how it's going to play out with larger injustices and tyrannies, real or perceived. So let's just go to the world stage. Again, I'm taking in this video a neutral position to make a point. Now, I'm just going to segue for a moment. People who know me know my position on this and how far I personally went to stand up for myself, but I digress. So now we have the whole world facing injustice, tyranny perhaps, again, real or perceived, and a lot of people were from not liking it to going a little bit crazy over it all. Now, in 2020, 2021, and 2022, I very clearly stated in my content when it would end, and it did. And I described it as a war of attrition. And all you had to do was survive, make it through. But there are some people who, influenced too much by Hollywood movies and television and everything else, romanticizing who they are and their role and all this other stuff, that decided to, from their perspective, do something about it. Okay. So this now is the protest of rubber. And certain people over those years, even to this day for some reason, are deemed as heroes and freedom fighters and everything else. And I highlighted when people were doing their protest of rubber, and they were, for example, in Ottawa, Ontario, how they were dancing and partying and having barbecues and everything else. And then when it was all over, they all went back home, carried on with their lives, except perhaps a few dozen people who went a little bit further. And these people who were eventually, how should I say, tagged for doing certain things, pay the price, because the opportunity they had that actually linked it to their alleged cause, which is up in the air what their alleged cause was, but whatever. They had the opportunity to say, okay, step back and deal with the issues before the courts, but they kept going. And for example, they had other charges laid, which created a gap between what they thought they were doing to these new charges, for example. They didn't handle it very well, because they had, for example, no experience. They were just emotionally charged, And this is why most people support them, because they've seen themselves, they can relate with these people because they see themselves in these people and how they want to react. Just all emotion and not thinking things through and taking the opportunity. That's most truther and freedom types. And most of them are just keyboard warriors, showing their support from the comfort of their own living room, wherever their laptop is or their phone or whatever. So now these people are dealing with the courts, again, being propped up as heroes, and people throwing money at their defenses, wasting their money. I've talked about this in fairly recent videos as well. And they go through trial. Specifically, I want to mention Pat King. And he wasted all the resources, all that money that was sent for his defense. Wasted the court's time, wasted everyone's time to be found guilty, which later he would apologize, admitting his wrongdoings. And I've done a video not too long ago talking about people who are guilty versus innocent, who are convicted, etc. But he really wasted people's time, this Pat King. The other guys, during the time in the interrogation room, crying and wanting to be with their families and everything else. And people throwing money to this day at these people. Meanwhile, there are real people who are actually trying to fight for truth and justice and help society overall, and no one cares. But you really have to think about how the commoner, these truther and freedom types, all willy-nilly call these people heroes, blatantly ignoring everything they did wrong. They want to keep that illusion going. Whether these people realize it or not, these people who were found guilty of other offenses, not really related to their cause, alleged cause, but these people drink the Kool-Aid and ruin their lives. We even seen, for example, I've highlighted in one video where their journals or whatever were talking about these being the end days and everything else, and it's like, wow, how their imagination just took over. But all the countless of cases that I described at the beginning of this video, that's real injustice, and you can see it, you can prove it. And how everyone's talking about the people involved with the protests of rubber and Pat King, how there was all this injustice and it's terrible what happened. They even admitted their guilt, whether it be in an interrogation room or after their convictions. They said, yeah, we were wrong. But people still want to hang on to that, I don't even know what. But I think what really irks me, and other people you've never heard of just like me, I'm not the only one. Perhaps I'm the only one that has the biggest mouth, that just keeps going. but I can only speak for myself. But what really irks me is how people treat me when I try to explain things to them, and things that I've said, say 2020, 2021, 2022, whether it be about when it's going to end or people's approach, what's going to happen, everything else, how everything became true, and people still treat me very poorly. And I'm struggling now to keep warm, to keep fed, trying to figure out getting some medications that I need because of my poor health and everything else. No one seems to really care. Let me just stop there for a second. When I say no one, I'm not forgetting about the people who have helped one way or another, whether it be through prayers, through sharing my story, through whatever they can, how much they can. I'm not forgetting about those people. I thank these people. So when I say no one, I'm generalizing in the big picture. And that's really, I just wanted to highlight how the countless cases and stories just like mine, and the examples that I gave at the start of this video, set the foundation for bigger injustices and tyrannies, even on the worldwide scale, on the worldwide stage. But people, it's amazing how people just can't grasp that. If you want to change the world, you start at the bottom, work your way up. See, if you try to go to the top, you're not going to get anywhere. Just fooling yourself. Just things to think about. That's all I have to say. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, comment, and share.
Listen to this and write it down if you can't remember it. You're never going to outgrow warfare. You simply must learn to fight. I hear people saying, when is it going to get easier? When you die.